I don't think that there's been a change in students, but a change in the influences in society that surround them. What is different is some of the influences that are available to those young people in society that are having an impact on how they learn. But in terms of what they bring to the table, Jay, no, I don't see any difference.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Today's guest, Domenic Scuglia, is someone I've had the privilege of knowing since I was 15. Dom was my first basketball coach, but after some persistent encouragement and successful recruiting, he became my rugby coach for 4 years and eventually my phys ed teacher as well. I didn't really know it then, but Dom would go on to play an important role in helping shape how I'd carry myself and navigate the world. He provided me and my friends with a role model of masculinity that was anything but toxic. He taught us toughness, yet also the ability to remain open, to carry ourselves with respect and dignity, and most importantly, to care for each other. And as you'll hear, this is something that remains part of his character to this day. But perhaps the best way to start this introduction is with a quote from the great existentialist philosopher and writer Albert Camus that really captures Dom's lasting impact on me. In an interview later in his life, Camus stated, quote, "After many years in which the world has afforded me many experiences, what I know most surely in the long run about morality and the obligations of men, I owe it to football." End quote. For Dom, as for me, we might swap football with rugby, but the sentiment remains. I often tell people that playing rugby fixed me in high school, and I owe much of this to Dom. For Dom, as you'd imagine, sports has been foundational in shaping his life as well, his leadership, and his enduring commitment to education. He has spent an incredible 41 years as an educator, holding a variety of roles, including 11 years as a principal in Ontario, and over 10 years as a superintendent and director of education in both Ontario and Saskatchewan. Alongside his educational career, Dom, as you would imagine, has been a lifelong coach, with rugby at the heart of his passion. From 1992 to 1999, he served as the head coach of the York University Varsity rugby team, later becoming president of Rugby Ontario for a few years. And prior to that, he spent nearly a decade as the director of junior rugby in Ontario, where he led the development of youth rugby across the province. In today's conversation, he reflects on his Italian immigrant experience, his deep-seated desire to help and serve others, the values instilled in him by his family, his teachers, and teammates. We discuss the leadership lessons he learned on the rugby pitch, the importance of building relationships grounded in trust, and his sense of responsibility to Indigenous communities and other marginalized groups. We also touch upon the work of Dr. Richard Reeves and explore how schools can better support boys through a curriculum that meets their needs, the value of strong male role models in schools, the challenges posed by the lack of male teachers in K-8 schools, and the role of healthy masculinity in education. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to share my conversation with Domenic Scuglia. All right, Mr. Scuglia, thank you for joining the podcast. At this stage, I would have given you a proper introduction and probably some of our shared background. But one of the main reasons I wanted you on this podcast is because you directly had such an impact on my life when I was a teenager in high school. And I wanted to dive into that, and in particular, some of the work you've done with school districts, not only in Ontario, but in Saskatchewan as well. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jay, and it's always good to connect with you. I really enjoy our time together, both when you were a student of mine and then when we got to know each other when you were an adult working for a different company.
So one of the beautiful things about this podcast is I get to kind of explore some sides of folks I've known for a long time in different ways. So I do want to kind of learn a little bit about your background and how you grew up and how that impacted your work. But let's start. Can you give the audience just kind of a brief overview of who you are and the work you've done over the last 30 years?
Yeah, for sure. So, I graduated from York University and then went to University of Toronto Teachers College because I knew that that was what I wanted to become early on in my life. And then from there, I was fortunate to land a teaching job at an elementary school in Newmarket called St. Paul's. And then I spent the next 41 years in the same sector in education, doing a variety of roles: teacher, department head, principal, and then eventually director of education. And as you stated, I served as director of education in the city of Regina, the province of Saskatchewan, for the Catholic school boards, and then was fortunate enough to be given the same opportunity when I finished my contract in Regina to serve as the director of education for the York Catholic District School Board, a school board where I had spent 30 plus years as an educator.
Excellent. So I do want to dive into all of that in more detail. But let's start with give us the audience a sense of like where did you grow up? What part of Ontario, and what was it like growing up when you did?
So I was first generation Italian. My parents were newcomers to Canada, and they met here in the city of Toronto, got married, and I was the firstborn and of four children, three boys and a sister that I have. And the language that I first learned was Italian. And in fact, when I was enrolled in kindergarten, I didn't speak any English. I only spoke Italian. And I didn't realize how beneficial that would be to me much later in life when I was completely able to speak confidently in Italian. In fact, I can read it and I can write it if I have to. But when you speak to Italians, when I'm in a conversation, they said, "Were you born in Italy?" And that's how good my Italian was. And I attribute that to the fact that early acquisition of language, when I first arrived in kindergarten, I've never lost it. And I had opportunities later on to practice it, and it just helped to enhance it and allowed me to continue it. And there was a transfer of skills in French when I went to school, because the two languages are very similar with their verbs, etc. And so French was very easy. I took it right up to grade 13.
Did your parents put a big emphasis on education for you and your siblings?
Both my parents were dropouts. And so education was important for them, and they certainly put that emphasis on. But I think, me and my siblings were driven for education and improving ourselves. We saw how hard our parents worked. My dad was a tailor. We lived at Dufferin and St. Clair, right in the heart of what became Little Italy. And my mom was a cook. So, both skilled laborers in different ways. And I remember watching both of them really awkward hours, and they would do shifts in raising the four kids because my dad would come home from work and my mom would go to work because of the nature of what she was doing. And so I think that hard work ethic certainly had some influence on myself and my siblings later on in life.
Is there anything about your upbringing that you wish children today could experience?
Yeah, one of the things that I experienced as a child, and I reflect on it, and I'll get grief from my own children, of which I have three, in raising them, is that we had no organized sports available to us. They probably were, but my parents being immigrants,
Immigrant families,
we didn't. I mean, the only organized thing I ever remember being a part of was the Boy Scouts. And I remember religiously going once a week to the meetings. I really enjoyed them. I was a cub and then I was a scout, the camping outings. And one time, and I don't even remember how this happened, but I signed up for lacrosse, which was just a terrible mistake because I ended up taking a beating in that sport, not having any skill. Coach, I remember, was such a generous and gentle man and saved me a lot of times by pulling me off when he saw that I was taking a beating. But whereas my own kids, their lives were completely structured from the morning they woke up. I remember between my wife and I writing dates in the calendars just so we can keep their schedules coordinated, because we were, going in 3 different directions often with the 3 kids. My daughter was a competitive swimmer and the 2 boys played competitive hockey. And so it was busy. And so I would say that's probably the biggest distinguishing factor in the way I grew up and my kids have grown up.
So is there anything from that maybe more unstructured kind of environment that you wish kids had today? Like let me ask you the question a different way. As a child growing up Dufferin St. Clair area, how did you play as a child? What are your earliest memories of play?
Well, it was free play, and it was organized by us, and we made up the rules, and we did what we wanted to do, whether it was play tag or fort or make our own hockey nets with 2x4s, carry them to the schoolyard or to the local street, and just play pickup hockey, thinking we were Phil Esposito or Bobby Orr. Whereas nowadays, parents are invested with significant amounts of financial commitment and time commitment, which, to a certain degree takes away from that whole family dynamics if you're not intentional about putting time aside to break bread together as a family and enjoy a meal and just say, how are you doing today? I remember as a child that the time for us for supper was sacrosanct, and everybody was at the table, and it was non-negotiable for anybody to miss. So that was definitely a difference, and that I cherished, because my mom was a great cook, and so was my dad, and I loved coming home to home-cooked meals.
Excellent. So tell me a little bit about your education. I'm always very intrigued by first-generation immigrants and how they found their way into the education system. I, like you, spoke Italian going into JK, and I have some funny stories about not understanding. The teacher actually got a spanking, if you can believe that, still happening in the mid-'80s. Not that I'm not overly traumatized by it, but my parents were the first generation to go to school, and it was because on both sides, the parents were adamant that they become the first educated generation because it led to greater opportunities. It sounds like your parents had that same kind of structure for you, but how did you find your way into university? How did you find your way into what you wanted to study?
So that's a really good question. I think, we as young people instilled that into our consciousness intrinsically. We didn't really look for extrinsic ways to have that instilled in us. I don't remember, my parents really understanding what university was, or college for that matter. And just saying you need to go to school was the most important message that they kept delivering to us. And so I sort of had a major curveball thrown at me when I was in grade 13, because there was labor strife that took the teachers out of the classroom and onto the streets in November of my last year of high school. And it was a strike that lasted into February. So for many of my classmates, and we still see each other, so we get together once a month at a local establishment in Vaughan, those that are able to attend, and we still reflect on that last year of high school and how it influenced certain kids' pathways, because some dropped out of school, some didn't come back. And when we did come back, I'll never forget, the teachers were in a frantic rush to get whatever curriculum that they were able to put in front of us that was going to help us prepare to be successful in our post-secondary destinations. I remember dropping all kinds of courses because I realized that those courses, A, weren't for me, and B, weren't going to help me to get into the post-secondary school that I wanted to, which was University of Toronto. And at that time, University of Toronto, the entrance requirements were far above what my high school marks were. So I was accepted at York, and that's where I ended up going.
Well, that's another thing we have in common, same alma mater. When it comes to your learning, what do you remember as the first thing that you loved to learn?
Yeah, it's funny how it kind of evolved for me, but always standing up for the marginalized was something that I recall as a high school student. And I remember I was sitting in a phys ed class. It was a health class, and there was one of my classmates sitting in front of me who was being tormented by two other classmates, and the teacher wasn't present at the time. The teacher was late arriving. And so this is going on and on and on. And I'm sitting there, I was right behind him, and I was seething, listening to this. And finally, I don't know why, but I stood up and I just started yelling and telling those two boys to stop. It was like everybody in the class all of a sudden focused their attention on that moment. And then, I went to York University, and I took one of my college tutorials was the final solution, and I found myself surrounded by classmates that were children of survivors, and not really understanding the Holocaust really at that point, and just listening to the anger of my classmates. The professor was a rabbi, and he did a marvelous job of guiding non-Jewish students in coming to a place and working together in collaboration with our classmates that were Jewish. And that caused me to have further interest in wanting to be involved in that kind of equity work. And I think that when I was first assigned to my placement as a vice principal, where I was a white, homogeneous administrator in a school that was very diverse. In fact, I was the minority, and I'd spent the lion's share of my career up to that point where I was in a white Italian background, a school community where the values were the same, and now all of a sudden I was the minority, and it was a massive learning curve for me, and one that I think had a profound influence on the work that I did later on in my career as it relates to equity. And you see I'm wearing today Every Child Matters t-shirt. This is National Indigenous Heritage Month. And I think it's important, that's another marginalized group in Regina. 40% graduation rates for students in the province. And so it obviously is a focus. And in Ontario, we really don't have that recognition and understanding of some of the challenges that are put in front of our students at very young ages. So it's a long-winded way of answering your very succinct question. I hope I covered what you needed.
No, you definitely did. I mean, if I can kind of paraphrase there, it sounds to me that the calling for you was to educate, to be an educator, to help others. Does that sum it up accurately?
Yeah, I mean, again, we were chatting earlier about three people that I spend a lot of time listening to and reading about, and that's Brene Brown, Adam Grant, and Simon Sinek. And it's never about you. It's about what you can learn from others. And so I guess in answering your question, yes, I felt that I was called to service to help others for sure. But I learned just as much from the others as I hope I was able to impart on them.
That's nicely put. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about and kind of share our experience together with the audience is the role that sport has played for you. I met you before you were a teacher of mine. I believe you were my coach in 2 sports, right? Before I ever had you as a teacher, you coached me in basketball and you told me, in not these words, but essentially, listen, little short Italian kid, you're okay in basketball, but you should come play rugby with me. And I don't think I ever even heard of rugby at that point, but you invited a number of us out and showed us what the sport was all about. And the real reason that I bring this up is because I've been saying for years, as an anxious teenager trying to understand who he was and what role I was going to play, as a friend, as a family member, as a functioning member of society, I had no idea until I played rugby. And rugby fixed me, is how I say it. As a male that had all this energy, that had all this angst, I developed friendships, I developed bonds. That still to this day, when we see those teammates of ours, we still have that kind of unspoken bond that we matured together, let's say. What role did sports play in your life, and how did you find your way into rugby? I don't think I know this story. And then into coaching. And then I want to ask you the question again after. What did you learn from coaching that informed your work as a superintendent?
Yeah, so I was introduced to sports at high school, and I wrestled and I played rugby and football. So I'd say those were my 3 major sports. But before I even got there, I was big time violinist. Music was my passion. In fact, the violin teacher was pushing me to really practice more and refine some of my vibrato skills on the violin.
Mr. Scuglia, out of all the things that I would do you still play?
I do.
Oh my God, how did I not know this?
It's not one that comes to the forefront because I don't spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's had a profound influence on me in many ways because it's introduced me to many genres of music that I never would have come to appreciate as a result of that. And so it came to the point where the pressure was on to make a decision. Was I going to specialize in music and make the kind of commitment that my teachers were asking of me, or was I going to look for another way to fill my cup? And like things like you got to keep your nails sharp, and playing sports, you were hurting your fingers, you were hurting things that you needed to be able to perform. And so I made the decision that I wasn't going to specialize in music, and I moved away from it, and I moved into sports. And both areas had incredible teachers who I learned many things from. But I would say the area of leadership is the area that I learned the most from are the teachers who I had in my high school. And then my teammates when I went on to university, because I played varsity rugby at York, and some of my teammates were incredible leaders. And I remember being in a circle in a game we were losing, and our captain at the time, a gentleman by the name of Everett, took all of us just by the simple message he shared with us at that time, and changed the course of that game by what he told us and how he told us. And it was just so motivational. And we ended up winning that game. And I think that really set the tone for me when I was watching different leaders in action, and the values that I acquired through sport, commitment, dedication, loyalty, working together for the same cause were all qualities that were going to come, and I realized were important in the job that I was going to be doing as an educator in the classroom, and then later at the system level.
Yeah, yeah, and I wondered, those are obviously the same qualities you want to look for in, for example, other superintendents or principals. Did you just anecdotally find any correlation between folks that had those qualities and folks that played team sports? Was it something you looked for when you were hiring or thinking about which people would be well suited for those roles?
Yeah, I mean, as a teacher, you sit around and listen to a lot of different stories in the staff room. Then later, as an administrator, you hear a lot of different stories in your staff meetings and in other meetings. And what was evident for me was that the teachers who experienced the greatest amount of success were the ones who invested time in establishing a relationship. So the very first thing you're going to do if you want to be successful with these group of children that you've been entrusted with is that there has to be some kind of a relationship that you're going to have with them. And it's got to be a relationship that is one that they know is rooted in trust. And that to me is the most important quality you can bring to that relationship, because from there, then you can build other pieces in getting the most out of that young person, in helping them find their pathway to success in whatever it is going to be much later on. And I'll share with you because I went out west, and so I stopped coaching. The last team I coached was 2016. And then for the next 8 years, I was director of education in the 2 provinces, so I didn't do any coaching. And in February, I retired. So when I retired, I had several invitations from schools in York region to come back and help coach. And so looking for a way to give back, I decided that I would take up one of the schools in the offer. And I went back to the high school, and I spent the last 2 months helping the teacher coach a group of 14 and 15-year-olds. And so the first thing I asked the teacher to do was give me the class list, the team list. And so I would go home and I would go through the names, and I would try to connect the faces to the names. And when we took attendance, I said, I need to have you put your hand up when I call out your name so I can make a connection to the name and the face. And within a couple of days, I knew every player's name. And so I was able to, establish a name to a face. And I think that really helped me in my ability to connect with these kids. And as I reflect back on my career, I think that was a very important piece of the success that I had as a teacher and as a coach. Because for me, establishing a relationship that's rooted in trust was one of the most important things I could do in whatever the work was that was put in front of us.
So what would you say are some of the biggest differences in those students? And maybe it's too soon for you now because you were just coaching a few months, but maybe even general, like you've been in the education system, for the better part of 4 decades, right? What changes have you seen in students over the years?
So, I don't think that there's been a change in students, but a change in the influences in society that surround them. So the child that you were when you were in high school is no different than the child that I was working with 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. What is different is some of the influences that are available to those young people in society that are having an impact on how they learn. But in terms of what they bring to the table, Jay, no, I don't see any difference in it. And I reflect back on the kids that I had in my very first year when I taught elementary grade 7. In fact, I'm still connected to those kids. Some came to my wedding, and I saw one kid that the last time I saw him was 1984, and he now owns a Jamaican fast food restaurant in Newmarket. And I found out that he has that store. So I went to visit him and pick up some Jamaican food. I'm a foodie. That's another thing that is part of who I am as a person. And I didn't want him to know who I was until after I paid for my food, because I didn't want him to say, here, you can have it. So I was dealing with the girl, and I said, may I speak to Kirk? And so she went back in. Of course, he's 54 right now. And he looked, and I took him a while to kind of just put the face together, because I had hair back then and I wasn't wearing glasses. So I took my glasses off, took my hat off. Mr. Scuglia. And it was just a big embrace. And so it was like we just never left off. We started talking about the classmates, and he's still connected to those classmates. So really, honestly, Jay, the kids aren't any different today than they were 40 years ago. It's just, what do they have within their societal influence that's getting in the way or enhancing their ability to be successful?
Yeah, so like we're both familiar with and admirers of the work of Richard Reeves, for example, right? Who's doing a lot of work, and I think rightfully so, and necessarily so, getting a lot of attention to his work around boys and adolescents, and how in particular their development into what I think we can call healthy masculinity is being stifled. And this is seen in a whole number of measures. I'll put links here for the audience to take a look at Richard Reeves' research and work that I think is quite compelling. What are the differences you've noticed in how boys are succeeding or not over the years?
Well, biological. First of all, I really respect and admire the work of Dr. Reeves. I think he's done a lot of excellent work in bringing forward a concern for us in society that is relevant and true and needs to be addressed. And this is not at the expense of being misogynist in terms of the rights of women to have equal footing with men, because for years men have had the upper edge. They've had, and still, when you go into major corporations, the majority of our leaders are males. But that's slowly starting to shift because of the intentionalities put into policy and practices and hiring practices to equalize that playing field so that women have the same kind of opportunities that men have. Dr. Reeves's research is indicating that the pendulum has now swung back a little bit so that boys are not experiencing the same kind of success. And would I agree with that? And I would say, based on my humble observations as an educator, I would say that there is truth to that. But I would say that it's been a challenge for a number of years for boys, because I remember in the early 2000s there was an administrator that I worked with, and what he was pushing to allow boys to succeed in both math and science was he wanted to create gender-specific classes, so math and science classes only for boys, and tailor the curriculum for those kids. I think the intent was good, however, the setup wasn't, because the pedagogy that was used to support those boys in those classrooms didn't meet the needs of all the kids, and therefore the experiment was not successful. However, I think that based on my experiences, there's still much work to be done in our schools to support boys in ways that they are going to be able to have the same kind of success on standardized testing, on graduation rates, because right now you're seeing the girls are scoring higher on all of those
like a crazy
assessments.
number, like 2-1 generally,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a huge disparity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like, I mean, neither of us are experts in this field, right? But again, the reason why I wanted to have you here is because I think you fundamentally fix something in me. Now, by encouraging me to play rugby, but then more than that, being a role model, a strong male role model. Now, I don't think we've talked about this. I don't know how much you remember. I know you taught a lot of tough, stubborn kids, but I remember several run-ins we had together where you weren't always or I shouldn't say, the way I should phrase it is, you put me in my place a number of times, and I'm almost certain they were rightly so, right? But in doing that, you taught me respect. You taught me hard work. You would get on me for the right things, the right reasons. You encouraged me to do more. You saw talent in me when I wasn't sure it was there. And I know it's not just me. You were like this for, what do we have, 20 players at the time on each team we played on? Something like that. So just from your experience and your work in coaching, what role do you think more activity, if it's not something like rugby where I do think there's a physical element that boys need to get out, but what kind of other physical kind of opportunities there are to engage boys, if that's even where you would go with that? Just generally speaking, what would you suggest we can do either at home or at schools to allow in some degree, I think what I'm asking is boys to be boys?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words, Jay. I certainly enjoyed having you as a student, and as much as I was able to impart on you, you equally taught me many things as well. Because if I go into this as a learning opportunity with a one-way street, it's not going to be successful. I've always approached rugby. Rugby was my main sport. I coached hockey, I've coached volleyball, basketball, cross country, track and field, you name it. I've done them all. Jack of all trades, master of one, and the one is rugby. And I've always coached rugby from the perspective that I'm not out to teach young boys to become professional rugby players, although that was an asset if it happened, but more about teaching life skills. So the sport was the vehicle we used to teach life skills to kids, because I knew that all of those qualities that you were engaged in as a young boy and being taught to you by someone who's also a male, I felt strongly that there would be a positive benefit later on in life. And I've been very privileged that the relationships that I've established with the young people that I've been fortunate enough to coach, that I have the opportunity to meet them later on in life. And there isn't a greater joy or moment of pride that's larger than when I hear stories like yours of my former students and what they're doing in life and how they have succeeded. And it's not just about the money. It's about their happiness. It's about what stage they're at with their families, their own kids now, their jobs that they're happy doing. And that, as an educator, there is no greater joy when that happens. And I've been privileged and fortunate enough to have that come back to me in experiences that I've had in meeting some of my former students.
So, as someone that's, still coaching, right, after all this time, and I'm sure even in your role as superintendent or director of education, you took those skills and viewed part of your role as coaching the next generation of leaders to step up in the school district. But in particular, with all the men and boys you've worked with over the years, what have you learned about masculinity? Or to ask this question a different way, what does it mean to be masculine?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question and distinction we need to make today, because the stereotypical male exhibits tons of machismo, and is strong, is
A
the center
fighter,
of attention, a
right?
fighter, aggressive, all
Loud.
of those qualities. And what I've learned in my role as an administrator and as a director is that there are many boys who don't fit into that stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the pandemic that we've just recently experienced certainly has exacerbated that understanding, from the point of view that we've entered a society that is very divided. And the polarization of this society has created different camps, which are causing conflict within our communities that are not easy to manage. And so boys who don't fit into that stereotype are really experiencing a strong sense of detachment, of exclusion, and to enter into the conversation of how do we create that community of belonging, that sense of inclusion. That's a difficult conversation to have when you're working within polarized environments. And when you get to be the CEO of an organization, that buck stops with you. Every decision you make is going to make some people happy and another group very unhappy.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. First of all, you make that distinction because, even in the era I grew up in, there was like our fathers, my father, your father, and probably the fathers in between, had that model of the John Wayne type of dad, the strong, silent type. And I think that has done damage to how fathers have raised kids over the years. From the perspective,
100%.
right? From the perspective of like, how many times your boys don't cry? My father didn't. I happen to be one of the really lucky ones, and my father's a poet, pretty much, right? So, he would tell me things like, "Express your feelings. It's okay to cry." But just from my environment around me, I hated crying because I felt that boys, shouldn't cry, shouldn't show their emotions that way, and a number of other things. Like I think a lot of boys don't get into art because it's not something that boys should do, and I'm hoping this is starting to change now. So I want to ask you, what can we do to structure the education system so not only we kind of redefine what masculinity is, and I do think, by the way, strength is part of what it means to be masculine, and it can be a variety of different types of strength. It doesn't always have to be physical. But what can we do to better structure the system so boys have a better chance of success and being comfortable in their masculinity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you were caught off guard when we started our introduction on this podcast that I played the violin.
Mm.
And that's not something that you knew about me, but may be perceived in certain circles as not necessarily a masculine quality.
Mm.
And for me, I think it's important that the male role models for young kids allows them to express themselves unconditionally in any way, shape, or form they want without judgment. And I think for some people in my position who have positions of responsibility, whether it be a teacher, a coach, or a CEO, if you don't communicate that, allowing that individual to express themselves in the way they want, and that all things coming to the table are allowed and acceptable, then we will continue to perpetuate the stereotypes. So it's important that there's a paradigm shift in how we train our people who will be going through teachers college, administrators who become principals in schools, that they have that awareness and that understanding that, in order to break down those stereotypes, we have to model that it's okay to be who you want to be. And you can do that and be loved unconditionally by me as your teacher, as your friend, and you won't be judged for what you bring to the table.
Yeah. Now tell me if you agree or disagree with this. I think one part of that mentorship or modeling, as you phrased it, is not enough elementary school age boys see male teachers. There is a serious lack in the profession.
That's a fact that we could provide data to support what you just said. And certainly visually from my visits to schools, when I go through a K-8 school, it would not be uncommon for me to walk through that school and encounter no male role models. And in other words, from the principal to the teachers to the support staff are all females. That would not be uncommon. You're starting to see a shift, but that shift is slowly. But then, in high school, you'll see more males, but where you'll see more males is you'll see them in the sciences, you'll see them in the maths, and whereas in the literature, the histories, you're going to see more females. And so again, we perpetuate those stereotypes by the role models that end up in front of those classrooms with those young students. And we can extend that to also include, our racialized communities, that they don't see themselves in their teachers either. And that's another area that, we need to work at. Although I know that's not the focus of this podcast, but I did want to mention that.
Yeah, I know, and certainly can be. I mean, to me, the reason I bring it up is because we look at all the problems, and you talked about the polarization, and some of these are massive problems and will take years, if not decades, to solve. But what I'm particularly interested in exploring in this podcast are some really practical solutions, right? Like we can have in Ontario, say, where we both of us are today, a concerted effort to make these kind of hires that make a significant impact of just having the right type of people in the right spots for the next 10 years. Just by virtue of showing up every day to work, right? And that's a practical solution to me. So that seems very, very, very feasible. And that these are the kind of things that I don't think we talk about as an education group, those of us that are interested in impacting education enough. What are the things that we can really influence our governments to make some concerted efforts to try to achieve, right? And I think this is one of them. But on that note, let me ask you, as someone who's, pretty much seen and done everything in the K-12 system over the years, if you look forward, let's say 50 years into the future of the K-12 education system, and just let's say generically in Ontario, Canada, say, what does that look like for you? Does it look great? Does it look scary? What are the things that you see, again, time horizon 50 years out?
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I'm always the glass half full optimist. And I believe that, you need to model optimism for young people to be able to have hope for their own futures. But I look at our global society and I'm worried. I'm worried because of the polarization that we're seeing, not just within our own local communities, but right across the world. We can look, south of the border in the United States and see that polarization where there are two different camps on just about every single issue. I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about our responsibility, as Pope Francis has reminded us through his encyclical Laudato Si, that we need to pay attention to the environment. If we don't, we can do whatever we think we're going to do to help prepare people for their future, but that future is looking glim unless we pay attention to what's happening to our environment. And that, I think, is part of the social justice teaching that we have to instill in our kids, so that they're not taking their plastic bottle and throwing it just anywhere. In fact, maybe moving away from plastic bottles and using more sustainable types of things. So, and of course, the governments that are in conflict and war, the conflict that's happening right now in Poland, in Ukraine and Russia, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and the other conflicts that are happening in Africa. Although they're localized conflicts, they have the potential to become something that would bring about another global war. And so those are things that really concern me. And I think it's important for us as educators that we prioritize the discussion in our classrooms around how to navigate some of those challenges in the future. I'll reference a Holocaust survivor, God rest his soul, Max Eisen, who was a good friend and an incredible human being who survived Auschwitz. And I'll never forget, he always started his presentations with, "It always starts with words." And so words are very powerful and will guide different societies in different directions depending on what you say, who you say it about, when you say it, and how you say it. And I think, the most powerful tool we have to change that narrative, and again, I'll quote another powerful leader who was the person who led the Truth and Reconciliation 94 Calls to Action, Justice Murray Sinclair. And he'll always remind us that it was education that got us into this mess, and it's education that's going to get us out of this mess. And so I think it's important for us that as educators, from that perspective, is that when we're not just teaching, different, different elements of education that are going to help you get a good job, but we need you to be a good global citizen on top of that.
I think that's just beautifully put. So if I can ask you to follow up on that by posing this scenario to you. If you had a magic wand, how would you change or structure the education system? Now, magic wand means you can do anything at any time, anywhere. What would you make the system look like so we can maybe get to some of those global citizens when they're 20, 22, 25?
Yeah, so I think if we stick with, Justice Murray Sinclair and Max Eisen's messages, and prioritize our curriculum. And, the curriculum is now, if we're taking a literacy or a numeracy course or a philosophy course, it's very prescriptive. I think that whether you're taking a physics class or you're taking an entrepreneurial class or you're taking, a religion class, built within that curriculum, there needs to be an opportunity to have some kind of connection on how you're going to be a better global citizen. And there was, he's a senator now, and his name escapes me, but it may come to me as we continue to talk. And he was the commissioner for human rights in the province of Saskatchewan, and then later became a senator, and is a current sitting senator for the government of Canada. And he put together a powerful curriculum on citizenship. And it had 6 main areas for focus on becoming a good citizen. And if you focus on these 6 areas, in addition to all the other curricular areas that you need to be prepared to get a good work from a post-secondary perspective, you will become a good citizen as well. So things like, how to teach how to treat your fellow human being, how to understand the history of all the marginalized communities within our society, and then move forward in walking in hand in partnership with those marginalized communities so that they will also have the same kinds of opportunities. Like you and I are sitting here as 2 white privileged individuals who, by virtue of our skin color, have been afforded opportunities that others haven't because of where they've come from. And I think that narrative needs to change, and it needs to change through our education system by the intentionality of building that understanding and conversation in the curriculum. And as important is equip those people in front of those kids to be able to navigate that kind of curriculum, because unfortunately there are some educators that are afraid to go into that arena because they might say or do the wrong thing. And so they'll just stay away from it and they won't engage in it. And that does harm as well. So I would see instilling confidence in those educators of the future that, you're going to do more good for our world by engaging in those conversations than staying away from them.
Well, Mr. Scuglia, this was everything I hoped for, and I hope the audience kind of got a sense of who you are. And by the way, for the record, yes, I was not stereotyping you as a male jock. I just statistically, you are an anomaly. There are no rugby players that play the violin. It's a statistical anomaly. Okay. So with that
point taken.
With that, to wrap up, can you recommend a podcast, book, video, something that you think an audience of people in the education space, edtech, would be interested in?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I continue to be a lifelong learner. I continue to pick up books and listen to podcasts that help me become a better person. Lately, I've become a big fan of Kim Scott. And Kim Scott has written a book called Radical Candor. And she's just recently released the precursor to Radical Candor called Radical Respect. And I think what she did was reflect on, after releasing Radical Candor, saying, I really haven't explained to my audience, how do we get to radical candor if we don't understand radical respect? And so that was a really important, I haven't read Radical Respect, but I've been listening to her podcasts around radical respect, and it certainly makes sense what she's done. I would recommend reading her work. She's written some incredibly powerful ideas that are rooted in establishing relationships when you're giving feedback. And if you haven't taken the time to establish that relationship, it doesn't matter what your feedback is going to be. It's not going to be as effective as if that relationship wasn't established in the first place.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll make sure that's included in notes. Mr. Scuglia, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Jason.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.